What happens when a hero hides in plain sight? When someone who once saved lives is dismissed as just another invisible worker? This is the story of Maria Santos, a janitor whose mop and bucket concealed medals of valor that would shake an entire military installation to its core. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Fort Harrison as Maria Santos pushed her cleaning cart down the endless hallway. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished linoleum, a sound that had become the soundtrack of her existence for the past 3 years. At 42, Maria moved with a purposeful efficiency that most people never noticed. She was, after all, just the janitor. The base personnel hurried past her without acknowledgement, their pressed uniforms and confident strides marking them as important people with important places to be. Maria had learned to make herself invisible, to blend into the background like the institutional beige paint that covered every wall. She emptied trash bins with methodical precision, wiped down surfaces until they gleamed, and ensured that every corner of the sprawling military complex met standards that would make drill sergeants proud. But there was something different about the way Maria worked. While other maintenance staff chatted and took frequent breaks, she approached each task with an intensity that bordered on reverence. She understood that cleanliness in a military environment wasn't just about appearance. It was about readiness, safety, and the kind of attention to detail that could mean the difference between life and death. Her supervisors had noticed her exceptional performance, though they attributed it to nothing more than a strong work ethic and perhaps a touch of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Maria's small apartment off base reflected the same meticulous attention to detail. Every surface was spotless, every item had its designated place, and her few possessions were arranged with military precision. The neighbors in her modest housing complex knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself, worked long hours, and never caused trouble. They had no idea that the woman who cleaned their hallways had once rappelled from helicopters into hostile territory, had performed life-saving medical procedures under enemy fire, and had earned commendations that most career soldiers could only dream of achieving. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. 3 years ago, Maria Santos had been Staff Sergeant Maria Elena Santos, a decorated Army medic with 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. She had been part of elite units that operated in the most dangerous regions of those conflicts, providing medical support to special operations teams and forward combat units. Her service record read like something from an action movie: multiple Bronze Star medals, a Silver Star for gallantry in action, and a Purple Heart from the IED explosion that had finally ended her military career. The blast that changed everything had occurred during her final deployment. Maria's convoy had been traveling through a particularly volatile region when the lead vehicle struck a sophisticated roadside bomb. The explosion had killed 2 soldiers instantly and left 3 others critically wounded. Despite suffering a severe concussion and multiple lacerations from shrapnel, Maria had crawled through the wreckage to reach the injured men. For 43 minutes, she had performed emergency surgery in the back of a damaged Humvee while under sporadic sniper fire, using improvised tools and whatever medical supplies she could salvage from the destroyed vehicles. Her actions that day had saved 3 lives, but the traumatic brain injury she sustained had ended her military career. The doctors had been blunt about her condition. While she retained most of her cognitive abilities, the injury had left her with chronic headaches, occasional balance issues, and difficulty processing complex information under stress. The Army had offered her a medical retirement with full benefits, acknowledging her service and sacrifice. But Maria had struggled with the transition to civilian life in ways that her medical evaluations couldn't capture. The nightmares had been the worst part. Not just the standard PTSD flashbacks that many veterans experienced, but a persistent sense of purposelessness that gnawed at her daily. For 15 years, Maria's identity had been built around serving others, protecting her fellow soldiers, and being part of something larger than herself. Civilian life felt hollow by comparison, a series of meaningless routines that failed to provide the sense of mission that had once driven her. She had tried various jobs after her discharge, working at a veterans hospital, attempting to use her medical training in civilian healthcare, even considering a career in emergency medical services. But each position had felt wrong somehow, either too removed from the military culture she understood or too demanding for her injury-related limitations. The constant headaches made it difficult to work in high-stress medical environments, and the bureaucracy of civilian healthcare frustrated her in ways that military red tape never had. The janitorial position at Fort Harrison had been meant as a temporary solution, a way to pay bills while she figured out her next move. But something about being back on a military installation had felt right in a way that civilian jobs never had. The familiar rhythms of military life, the crisp efficiency of military personnel, even the institutional architecture reminded her of who she had once been. She had taken the job with the understanding that it would be a brief stopover, a chance to catch her breath before moving on to something more substantial. That had been 3 years ago, and Maria had settled into a routine that provided stability, if not satisfaction. She arrived at work each morning at 0500 hours, a habit ingrained by years of military service that she saw no reason to change. Her supervisors appreciated her reliability and attention to detail, though they remained unaware of the military precision that informed her approach to even the most mundane tasks. She cleaned offices, emptied wastebaskets, and maintained restrooms with the same thoroughness she had once applied to maintaining medical equipment in combat zones. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maria had once been responsible for the most sophisticated medical equipment in the military arsenal, had performed procedures that required years of specialized training, and had made life or death decisions in situations that would paralyze most people. Now she was responsible for ensuring that toilet paper dispensers were properly stocked, and that conference room tables were free of dust. The work itself didn't bother her. She had learned long ago that no honest work was beneath anyone's dignity, but the invisibility stung more than she cared to admit. The military personnel at Fort Harrison saw her uniform and assumed they knew everything about her. The beige shirt and dark pants marked her as maintenance staff, someone whose opinions didn't matter and whose presence could be safely ignored. Officers walked past her as if she were furniture, discussing classified operations and personnel matters with the casual assumption that the cleaning lady posed no security risk. Enlisted personnel were more polite, but equally dismissive, offering occasional nods of acknowledgement that felt more like reflexive politeness than genuine recognition. Maria had grown accustomed to the treatment, had learned to find a strange comfort in her anonymity. There was something liberating about being overlooked, about moving through a world where no one expected anything from her beyond competent janitorial work. She could observe without being observed, could listen to conversations without anyone worrying about operational security, could move through restricted areas with a freedom that her former rank had never provided. But late at night, alone in her apartment, Maria sometimes pulled out the wooden box she kept hidden in her bedroom closet. Inside, carefully preserved in tissue paper, were the medals and commendations that told the story of her real life. The bronze stars that recognized her valor in combat, the silver star that acknowledged her gallantry under fire, the purple heart that marked her sacrifice. She would hold each medal carefully, remembering the circumstances that had led to its award, the fellow soldiers whose lives had been saved or lost, the missions that had pushed her to the limits of her capabilities. Memories were simultaneously painful and precious. Painful because they reminded her of a life that was gone forever, a sense of purpose and importance that she would never reclaim. Precious because they represented the best version of herself, the person she had been when her skills mattered and her decisions carried weight. The medals were proof that Maria Santos had once been someone significant, someone whose actions had made a difference in the world. Most nights, she would carefully return the medals to their box and push the memories back into the corner of her mind where they belonged. She had learned that dwelling on the past was a luxury she couldn't afford. That survival required focusing on the present reality of her diminished circumstances. But sometimes, particularly after difficult days when the dismissive treatment felt especially sharp, she would hold the medals a little longer and remember what it felt like to be respected for her competence rather than ignored for her perceived insignificance. The morning routine at Fort Harrison never varied. Maria would arrive at the maintenance building before dawn, check her assignment sheet, and load her cart with the supplies needed for the day's work. The other janitors were pleasant enough, though they came from different backgrounds and had little in common with her beyond their shared employment. They talked about television shows she didn't watch, complained about supervisors she found perfectly reasonable, and discussed personal problems that seemed trivial compared to the challenges she had faced in combat zones. She had learned to participate in these conversations just enough to avoid seeming antisocial, but not so much as to invite deeper scrutiny. Her coworkers knew that she lived alone, had no family in the area, and kept to herself outside of work. They attributed her reserved nature to shyness, rather than the carefully maintained operational security that had become second nature during her military service. Maria had learned that the less people knew about her background, the simpler her life became. The work itself required a level of security clearance that surprised many people. Janitors at military installations underwent background checks and received training on handling classified materials, even if their primary responsibility was emptying trash bins that might contain sensitive documents. Maria's clearance level was actually higher than necessary for her position, a remnant from her military service that her supervisors had never questioned. They assumed she had been military police or perhaps worked in administration, roles that would explain her familiarity with military protocols without suggesting the kind of specialized training that might raise questions about why she was pushing a mop. The daily routine took her through every area of the base. Administrative offices where clerks processed paperwork that kept the military machine running. Briefing rooms where officers planned training exercises and discussed personnel matters. Medical facilities where current military medics treated everything from routine checkups to combat injuries sustained during training. Each environment brought its own set of memories and emotions that Maria had learned to compartmentalize with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing trauma in high-pressure situations. The medical facilities were the most challenging. The familiar smell of antiseptic, the organized chaos of emergency response drills, the sophisticated equipment that she had once operated with expert precision, all of it reminded her of capabilities she no longer possessed in a life she could never reclaim. She cleaned around medical equipment that she could have operated blindfolded, emptied waste containers filled with medical supplies she had once used to save lives, and listened to conversations between medics who possessed a fraction of her experience but held positions of responsibility that were forever beyond her reach. But Maria had developed coping mechanisms that allowed her to navigate these emotional challenges. She focused on the technical aspects of her current work, taking pride in the precision with which she maintained even the most mundane equipment. She found satisfaction in ensuring that medical facilities met the highest standards of cleanliness. Knowing that her work contributed to the safety and health of military personnel, even if her contribution went unrecognized. She reminded herself that every job in the military served a purpose, that maintaining the infrastructure that supported combat operations was just as important as the operations themselves. The officers and enlisted personnel at Fort Harrison had no way of knowing that the woman who cleaned their offices had once been briefed on classified operations, had held security clearances that exceeded those of many senior officers, and had been trusted with responsibilities that few people could handle. They saw the uniform and made assumptions based on appearances, never questioning whether there might be more to Maria Santos than met the eye. In their defense, there was no reason for them to suspect that their janitor possessed combat experience and medical training that rivaled that of anyone on the base. As Maria moved through her daily routine, she observed the military personnel around her with the trained eye of someone who had once been responsible for their safety and welfare. She noticed when soldiers showed signs of stress or fatigue, when officers seemed overwhelmed by their responsibilities, when the base's operational tempo suggested unusual activity or heightened readiness levels. Her observations were automatic, the result of years of training that had taught her to assess situations and personnel with the kind of attention to detail that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. But she kept these observations to herself, just as she kept everything else about her past carefully hidden. Maria Santos, the janitor, was supposed to be invisible, unremarkable, someone whose presence could be safely ignored by people with more important things to worry about. She had constructed this identity carefully, learning to speak and act in ways that supported the illusion of someone whose aspirations extended no further than steady employment and regular paychecks. The deception had become so complete that sometimes Maria almost believed it herself. Colonel Rebecca Hartwell had been commanding Fort Harrison for 18 months when she first noticed the way her subordinates deferred to her authority without question. The sprawling military installation had been her reward for a career built on rigid adherence to protocol and an unwavering belief that military efficiency came from absolute control. Her corner office overlooked the parade grounds where soldiers conducted their daily formations, a view that reinforced her conviction that she understood exactly how a military base should operate. At 53, Hartwell had climbed the ranks through a combination of political acumen and an ability to implement cost-cutting measures that impressed Pentagon budget analysts. She had never seen combat, had never deployed to hostile territories, and had spent her career in administrative positions that rewarded bureaucratic efficiency over operational excellence. Her understanding of military leadership came from textbooks and staff college courses, rather than the harsh realities of battlefield decision-making. But she possessed the kind of confidence that comes from never having her assumptions tested. Under fire, the colonel's management philosophy centered on what she called optimized resource allocation, a euphemism for cutting costs wherever possible while maintaining the appearance of operational readiness. She had implemented efficiency protocols throughout Fort Harrison that eliminated what she considered redundant positions, streamlined procurement processes, and reduced what she viewed as unnecessary expenditures. Her superiors praised her for bringing modern business practices to military operations, apparently unconcerned that her innovations often came at the expense of the kind of redundancy that military planners had historically viewed as essential for mission success. Hartwell's office reflected her personality with uncomfortable precision. Every surface was meticulously organized, with documents arranged in perfect stacks and personal items positioned at exact angles. The walls displayed her various certificates and commendations, arranged in a pattern that drew attention to her academic achievements while subtly minimizing the absence of combat decorations. She had created an environment that projected competence and authority, carefully designed to remind visitors of her rank and accomplishments while discouraging the kind of informal interaction that might reveal the limitations of her actual experience. The colonel's daily routine began with a review of efficiency reports that tracked everything from energy consumption to personnel productivity metrics. She had implemented monitoring systems throughout the base that measured performance, indicators she had learned about during her business administration courses, applying corporate management techniques to military operations with the enthusiasm of someone who believed she was revolutionizing an outdated institution. Her staff meetings focused on cost-benefit analysis and process optimization rather than the traditional military concerns of readiness and mission capability. Fort Harrison support staff had learned to navigate Hartwell's management style with the adaptive skills that military personnel develop when dealing with challenging leadership. They provided her with the reports she demanded, attended the meetings she scheduled, and implemented the policies she mandated while quietly maintaining the informal networks that actually kept the base functioning. The experienced non-commissioned officers understood that her innovations often created problems that required creative solutions, but they had learned to address these issues without drawing attention to the shortcomings of her leadership approach. Maintenance department had been one of Hartwell's early targets for efficiency improvements. She had conducted a comprehensive review of janitorial operations, analyzing everything from supply usage to time allocation in her quest to identify cost-saving opportunities. The review had resulted in reduced staffing levels, consolidated supply orders, and new productivity standards that required maintenance personnel to clean more areas in less time while using fewer resources. The changes had generated impressive cost savings that looked excellent in her quarterly reports. Higher command. Hartwell took particular pride in what she called her Human Resources Optimization Initiative within the maintenance division. She had noticed that the janitorial staff included several workers whose background seemed inconsistent with their current positions, people who appeared overqualified for basic cleaning duties. Rather than viewing this as an opportunity to leverage hidden talents, she saw it as evidence of inefficient hiring practices that placed expensive personnel in positions that could be filled by workers with minimal skills and lower salary requirements. Maria Santos had caught the colonel's attention during one of her regular inspections of base facilities. Hartwell had been conducting her monthly walkthrough of the administrative building when she noticed the exceptional quality of the cleaning work in the offices that Maria maintained. The attention to detail was remarkable. Surfaces weren't just clean but precisely arranged. Equipment was positioned with military exactness, and even the smallest items were organized with a level of care that exceeded standard requirements. Most supervisors would have been pleased to discover such dedicated work, but Hartwell's reaction was different. The colonel's business training had taught her to be suspicious of employees who exceeded standard performance metrics without additional compensation. In her experience, such behavior indicated either a misunderstanding of job requirements or an attempt to justify higher wages through unnecessary perfectionism. She had learned to view exceptional performance as potentially wasteful, representing an inefficient allocation of time and energy that could be better directed toward additional tasks or cost savings. During subsequent inspections, Hartwell had observed Maria's work patterns with the analytical eye of someone looking for inefficiencies to correct. She noted that Maria spent more time in each area than the productivity standards required, that she used cleaning supplies with a precision that seemed excessive for basic janitorial work, and that she approached even routine tasks with an intensity that suggested either obsessive tendencies or a fundamental misunderstanding of her role. The colonel had begun documenting these observations, building a case for what she viewed as performance issues that needed to be addressed. The breaking point came during a budget review meeting where Hartwell was presenting her latest cost-saving initiatives to the base's senior staff. She had been outlining plans to further reduce maintenance expenditures when the facility management officer mentioned that one of the janitors was consistently exceeding productivity targets while maintaining unusually high quality standards. Rather than viewing this as positive news, Hartwell saw it as confirmation of her suspicions about inefficient resource allocation in the maintenance department. Exceptional performance in basic maintenance positions indicates either overstaffing or overqualification, she announced to the assembled officers. Both represent inefficient use of taxpayer dollars and suggest opportunities for optimization. Her tone carried the authority of someone who had never questioned whether military operations might require different management approaches than corporate environments. and her confidence convinced several junior officers that she must understand something about personnel management that they had missed. The colonel's investigation into the maintenance department revealed what she considered alarming evidence of inefficient hiring practices. Several janitors possessed educational backgrounds or work experience that exceeded the basic requirements for their positions, while others demonstrated skills that suggested previous training in unrelated fields. To Hartwell, this represented a systemic failure to match personnel qualifications with job requirements, resulting in overpayment for basic services and missed opportunities to reduce labor costs. Maria Santos became the focal point of Hartwell's efficiency review when the colonel discovered that her security clearance level exceeded what was necessary for janitorial duties. The background check that had qualified Maria for her position revealed military service, but the specific details were classified at a level that Hartwell's administrative position didn't allow her to access. This limitation frustrated the colonel, who interpreted the restricted information as evidence that previous hiring decisions had been made without proper cost-benefit analysis. "We're paying military veteran wages for basic cleaning services," Hartwell complained to her deputy commander. During a private meeting in her office, the previous administration clearly failed to implement proper personnel screening procedures. "We need to address these inefficiencies before they become budget line items that attract attention from higher command." Her certainty about the nature of the problem reflected her assumption that all personnel issues could be resolved through better application of business management principles. The colonel's solution was characteristically direct. She would implement new performance standards for maintenance personnel that would eliminate what she viewed as wasteful practices while ensuring that all employees understood their roles and limitations. Workers who demonstrated skills beyond their job requirements would be counseled to focus their efforts on assigned tasks rather than exceeding standards that weren't necessary for mission accomplishment. The initiative would demonstrate her commitment to efficient operations while addressing what she saw as fundamental problems in personnel management. Hartwell scheduled individual meetings with maintenance supervisors to discuss implementation of her new efficiency protocols. She had prepared detailed presentations that outlined productivity metrics, cost-benefit analyses, and performance expectations based on industry standards she had researched during her business courses. The meetings were scheduled to begin with the most problematic cases, starting with employees whose performance patterns indicated the greatest deviation from optimal resource utilization. The maintenance supervisor, Master Sergeant James Crawford, had been dreading his meeting with Colonel Hartwell since receiving her memorandum about human resources optimization review procedures. Crawford had 32 years of military experience that had taught him to recognize the difference between leadership and management, and he had watched with growing concern as Hartwell implemented policies that prioritized cost savings over the kind of operational readiness that military installations required. He understood that his civilian employees were about to become casualties of efficiency initiatives that reflected fundamental misunderstandings about military operations. Crawford had tried to protect his team by implementing Hartwell's directives in ways that minimized their impact on actual operations, but he knew that his flexibility was limited when dealing with a commanding officer who viewed compromise as evidence of insubordination. The Master Sergeant had spent decades learning to work within military hierarchies, and he understood that challenging a colonel's decisions required evidence and timing that he didn't currently possess. His only option was to hope that Hartwell's inexperience would eventually become apparent to higher command before her policies caused serious problems. The meeting in Hartwell's office followed the pattern that had become familiar to Crawford during his interactions with the colonel. She presented her analysis with the confidence of someone who believed that business school techniques could solve any organizational challenge, while he listened with the resigned patience of someone who understood that arguing with flawed assumptions would only make the situation worse. The discussion focused on productivity metrics and cost calculations rather than the operational requirements that actually determined staffing needs. Master Sergeant Crawford, Hartwell began, consulting the folder of documents she had prepared for the meeting. My review of maintenance operations has identified several opportunities for improved efficiency. We need to address performance patterns that suggest misallocation of personnel resources. Her tone carried the authority of someone who had never questioned whether her analytical framework was appropriate for military environments, and her certainty made it clear that she expected compliance rather than discussion. Crawford nodded respectfully while internally preparing for what he knew would be another round of policy changes that would require creative implementation to avoid compromising base operations. He had learned that survival in Hartwell's command structure required apparent agreement with her initiatives while quietly maintaining the informal systems that actually kept Fort Harrison functioning. The Master Sergeant understood that his job was to protect his people and preserve operational capability, even when those priorities conflicted with official efficiency directives. The Colonel's presentation included detailed charts and graphs that analyzed maintenance productivity according to metrics she had adapted from corporate management literature. She had calculated optimal time allocations for each cleaning task, identified what she considered excessive supply usage, and developed performance standards that would eliminate what she viewed as unnecessary perfectionism in basic janitorial work. The analysis was comprehensive and professionally presented, reflecting hours of careful preparation and genuine belief in the superiority of business management techniques. Our current operations include personnel whose performance patterns indicate either overqualification or misunderstanding of job requirements, Hartwell continued, turning to a section of her presentation that focused specifically on individual cases. We need to implement corrective measures that align employee capabilities with position requirements while optimizing resource utilization. Her language reflected the business terminology she had learned during her administrative career, applied to military personnel issues with the confidence of someone who assumed that all organizational challenges were fundamentally similar. Crawford recognized that the Colonel's efficiency review was about to target some of his best employees, including several whose backgrounds and capabilities she clearly didn't understand. He had worked with Maria Santos for 3 years and had observed her exceptional performance, her attention to detail, and her professional competence that exceeded anything he had seen from civilian maintenance personnel. The Master Sergeant didn't know the specific details of Maria's military background, but his experience had taught him to recognize the signs of someone whose capabilities extended far beyond their current position. The meeting concluded with Hartwell's directive that Crawford implement new supervision protocols designed to ensure that all maintenance personnel focused their efforts on assigned tasks, rather than exceeding performance standards that weren't required for mission accomplishment. The Colonel's tone made it clear that she viewed this as a reasonable management decision that would improve operational efficiency while reducing unnecessary costs. Crawford accepted the directive with the professional demeanor that 32 years of military service had taught him to maintain, even when dealing with leadership decisions that he privately considered counterproductive. As the Master Sergeant left Hartwell's office, he understood that his most capable employees were about to face increased scrutiny and criticism for the same exceptional performance that had previously earned recognition and respect. The irony wasn't lost on him that a commanding officer was about to punish excellence in the name of efficiency, but his decades of military experience had taught him that some battles couldn't be won through direct confrontation. He would need to find creative ways to protect his people while maintaining the appearance of compliance with policies that fundamentally misunderstood the nature of military operations. Colonel Hartwell watched Crawford leave with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had successfully identified and begun addressing a significant operational inefficiency. Her confidence in business management principles convinced her that the maintenance department's problems could be resolved through better supervision and clearer performance expectations. She had no way of knowing that her efficiency initiatives were about to create the kind of personnel crisis that would eventually attract attention from levels of command that possessed very different perspectives on military leadership and the value of exceptional performance in uniform. The first sign of trouble came during the Monday morning staff briefing when Colonel Hartwell announced what she called enhanced supervision protocols for base maintenance operations. Maria was refilling paper towel dispensers in the conference room adjacent to the briefing area when she heard the colonel's voice carrying through the thin walls, outlining new efficiency standards that would require closer monitoring of personnel, performance patterns that deviate from established productivity metrics. Maria continued her work methodically, but her military training had taught her to process information quickly and recognize potential threats to operational security. The language Hartwell was using, talk of deviation from standards, enhanced monitoring, and productivity optimization, sounded like the prelude to personnel actions that would target anyone whose performance stood out from the baseline. After 15 years of military service, Maria understood that sometimes excellence became a liability when it attracted the wrong kind of attention from insecure leadership. Master Sergeant Crawford found Maria later that morning in the medical facility where she was performing her weekly deep cleaning of the emergency treatment areas. The precision with which she cleaned around sophisticated medical equipment had always impressed him, though he had never understood why a civilian janitor would demonstrate such familiarity with military medical protocols. Crawford's expression was grim as he approached, and Maria immediately recognized the look of a senior NCO who was about to deliver unwelcome news. "Santos, we need to talk," Crawford said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "The colonel has implemented new supervision requirements for maintenance personnel. Starting tomorrow, you'll be subject to daily performance evaluations and productivity monitoring." His tone carried the frustrated resignation of someone who disagreed with orders he was required to implement, and Maria understood that Crawford was warning her as much as informing her. The Master Sergeant explained Hartwell's new protocols with the careful language of someone who needed to maintain official support for command decisions, while subtly indicating his personal disapproval. Daily inspection reports would document time allocation, supply usage, and task completion rates for all maintenance personnel. Supervisors would evaluate whether employees were focusing their efforts appropriately or engaging in what the colonel termed excessive perfectionism that represents inefficient resource utilization. Maria listened with the composed attention that military training had ingrained, but internally she was conducting the kind of threat assessment that had kept her alive in combat zones. Hartwell's efficiency initiative was clearly targeting employees whose performance exceeded standard expectations, which meant that Maria's attention to detail and professional competence had marked her as a problem that needed to be solved. The irony that her military precision was being viewed as a civilian limitation wasn't lost on her, but she understood that explaining her background would only create different problems. "Master Sergeant, are there specific performance issues you need me to address?" Maria asked, maintaining the respectful tone that had characterized her interactions with Crawford throughout her employment. She had learned to speak carefully around military personnel, avoiding language or mannerisms that might reveal her own service background, while demonstrating the kind of professionalism that NCOs appreciated in civilian employees. Crawford's response confirmed what Maria had suspected. "Honestly, Santos, your work is exemplary. Better than anything I've seen from civilian maintenance staff. But the colonel seems to think that exceptional performance indicates overqualification or misallocation of resources." His frustration was evident despite his professional demeanor, and Maria recognized the position that experienced NCOs often found themselves in when required to implement policies they knew were counterproductive, the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Hartwell herself, making one of her surprise inspections that had become increasingly frequent since she had announced her efficiency review. Maria immediately adopted the invisible posture that she had perfected over 3 years of janitorial work, continuing her cleaning tasks while seeming to fade into the background. But Hartwell's attention fixed on her with the focused intensity of someone who had already identified a target for scrutiny. "Master Sergeant Crawford," Hartwell said without acknowledging Maria's presence, "I want to observe current maintenance procedures in action. This seems like an appropriate opportunity to evaluate performance patterns that may require optimization." Her tone carried the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance, and Maria understood that she was about to become the subject of official observation by a commanding officer who had already decided that her work ethic represented a problem. Crawford's discomfort was obvious to Maria, though he maintained the professional composure that senior NCOs developed through decades of navigating challenging command relationships. "Yes, ma'am. Santos is performing routine maintenance on medical facility equipment areas. Her work consistently meets all safety and cleanliness standards." His careful language attempted to frame Maria's performance in terms that wouldn't trigger Hartwell's efficiency concerns, but Maria could see that the colonel had already formed her opinions. Hartwell observed Maria's work with the analytical attention of someone looking for evidence to support predetermined conclusions. She noted the methodical way Maria cleaned around expensive medical equipment, the precision with which she organized supplies, and the careful attention she paid to maintaining sterile environments around treatment areas. Rather than recognizing these behaviors as evidence of competence and professionalism, the colonel interpreted them as proof of excessive time investment in tasks that could be completed more efficiently. "The time allocation for this area seems excessive," Hartwell announced after watching Maria work for several minutes. "Standard janitorial procedures shouldn't require this level of detailed attention. We need to implement time management protocols that ensure appropriate effort allocation." Her criticism was delivered in the authoritative tone of someone who had never performed the work she was evaluating, and Maria recognized the familiar pattern of inexperienced leadership making judgments about operational requirements they didn't understand. Maria continued working while the colonel spoke, demonstrating the kind of professional discipline that military service had taught her to maintain under pressure. She understood that any response would be viewed as defensive or insubordinate, so she focused on completing her assigned tasks while the two officers discussed efficiency improvements that would fundamentally change her working conditions. The conversation reminded her of briefings she had attended during her military career, where officers who had never performed specific duties would develop policies that ignored the practical realities of operational requirements. The medical equipment that Maria was cleaning represented millions of dollars in sophisticated technology that required careful handling and maintenance. Her attention to detail reflected both professional standards and an understanding of how equipment failures could impact mission-critical operations. But Hartwell's business-focused perspective interpreted this care as evidence of inefficient time management rather than recognition of operational importance, demonstrating the fundamental disconnect between corporate efficiency metrics and military operational requirements. Crawford attempted to provide context that might help the colonel understand why certain tasks required additional attention. "Ma'am, the medical facilities require enhanced cleaning protocols because of infection control requirements and the sensitivity of the equipment. Santos' thoroughness ensures that we maintain the standards that medical personnel need for safe operations." His explanation reflected both his understanding of actual operational requirements and his hope that practical considerations might influence Hartwell's policy decisions, but the colonel's response made it clear that she viewed Crawford's explanation as evidence of inadequate supervision rather than legitimate operational justification. Master Sergeant, that's exactly the kind of thinking that leads to inefficient resource allocation. We need to identify minimum acceptable standards and ensure that all personnel focus their efforts appropriately rather than exceeding requirements that add cost without corresponding value. Her confidence in business management principles blinded her to the possibility that military operations might require different approaches than corporate environments. The inspection concluded with Hartwell's directive that Crawford implement daily monitoring of Maria's time allocation and task completion rates. The colonel wanted detailed documentation of how long each cleaning task required, what supplies were used, and whether the results justified the investment of time and resources. The new protocols would be presented as performance improvement measures designed to help employees understand appropriate effort allocation for their assigned responsibilities. As the officers left the medical facility, Maria remained alone with her cleaning cart and the growing realization that her careful anonymity was about to be shattered by unwanted attention from command personnel. The military training that had taught her to maintain low profiles in hostile environments now seemed inadequate for dealing with a commanding officer who viewed competence as a threat to efficiency initiatives. She understood that her options were limited. She could either modify her performance to meet Hartwell's expectations or face increasing scrutiny that might eventually expose the background she had worked so hard to conceal. The afternoon brought the first implementation of Hartwell's enhanced supervision protocols. Crawford appeared with a clipboard and stopwatch, his expression conveying both professional duty and personal reluctance. Santos, I need to time your completion of assigned tasks and document supply usage as part of the new efficiency monitoring system, he explained with the resignation of someone required to implement policies he considered counterproductive. Maria nodded her understanding and continued with her scheduled cleaning of the administrative offices, but the presence of official observation changed the dynamic of her work in ways that went beyond simple performance measurement. Every action was now being evaluated according to metrics that prioritize speed over quality, efficiency over thoroughness, and cost savings over the kind of attention to detail that military operations actually required. She found herself caught between maintaining the professional standards that her military background demanded and conforming to civilian expectations that prioritize different values. The timing exercise revealed exactly what Maria had expected. Her methodical approach to cleaning required more time than Hartwell's efficiency standards allowed, but produced results that exceeded what those standards required. Crawford documented the discrepancy with obvious reluctance, understanding that his report would be used to justify performance improvement measures that would ultimately compromise the quality of maintenance operations. The Master Sergeant's military experience had taught him to recognize the difference between leadership that enhanced operational capability and management that prioritized metrics over mission accomplishment. Word of the new supervision protocols spread quickly through the maintenance staff, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and concern that affected morale throughout the department. Other janitors began modifying their work patterns to avoid the kind of attention that Maria was receiving, understanding that exceptional performance had become a liability rather than an asset. The efficiency initiative was achieving exactly the opposite of its intended effect, reducing overall performance quality while creating anxiety among employees who had previously taken pride in their work. By the end of the week, Maria had been subjected to 5 daily evaluations that documented her excessive attention to detail, her inefficient time allocation, and her unnecessary use of cleaning supplies. Each report built the case that Colonel Hartwell was constructing for what she viewed as necessary personnel action to address performance issues that represented inefficient resource utilization. The documentation process had become a ritualized criticism of the same professional competence that had once earned Maria medals for excellence under pressure. Crawford delivered the week's evaluation summary with visible frustration, knowing that his reports were being used to justify policies that would ultimately harm base operations. Santos, you need to understand that the Colonel views your current performance patterns as problematic. She's requesting that you modify your approach to focus on minimum acceptable standards rather than exceeding requirements. His careful language attempted to warn Maria about the escalating nature of the situation while maintaining official support for command directives. Maria accepted the criticism with the same composed professionalism that had characterized her response to hostile fire in combat zones, but internally she was preparing for the kind of sustained campaign that would eventually force her to make difficult choices about her future. The woman who had once performed emergency surgery under enemy fire was now being criticized for cleaning medical equipment too thoroughly, and the irony highlighted the vast distance between her current life and the military career that had once defined her identity. The enhanced supervision had attracted attention from other base personnel, who observed the unusual level of scrutiny being applied to maintenance operations. Officers and enlisted personnel who worked in areas that Maria cleaned began noticing the daily timing sessions and documentation procedures, creating speculation about what kind of performance issues might justify such intensive monitoring. The visibility of Hartwell's efficiency initiative was generating exactly the kind of attention that Maria had spent 3 years trying to avoid. As Maria completed her shift on Friday afternoon, she understood that the weekend would provide only temporary respite from an escalating situation that was unlikely to resolve in her favor. Colonel Hartwell's determination to optimize resource allocation had identified Maria as a problem that required solving, and the military hierarchy that had once protected her as a valued member of the team was now being used to justify actions that would eliminate her as an inconvenient deviation from efficient operations. The battle lines were being drawn by a commanding officer who had no idea that she was targeting someone whose military service record would have commanded respect from any officer who understood the true meaning of excellence under pressure. The systematic campaign against Maria intensified during the second week of Hartwell's enhanced supervision protocols. The colonel had established what she called a performance improvement timeline that required daily documentation of every deviation from optimal efficiency standards. Maria found herself under constant observation, with supervisors timing her tasks, measuring her supply usage, and documenting what they were required to classify as excessive quality standards that exceeded operational requirements. Monday morning brought a new level of scrutiny when Hartwell assigned Sergeant First Class Jennifer Walsh from the Base Administration Office to conduct what she termed productivity optimization assessments. Walsh, a career administrative specialist with limited understanding of maintenance operations, had been instructed to shadow Maria throughout her daily routine and identify opportunities for streamlined task completion that eliminated unnecessary perfectionism. Walsh approached her assignment with the mechanical precision of someone following orders she didn't fully understand. She carried a digital tablet loaded with efficiency measurement software that Hartwell had acquired through her business management contacts, tracking Maria's movements through predetermined productivity metrics that reduced complex janitorial work to simple time and motion calculations. The technology was impressive and completely inappropriate for evaluating the nuanced requirements of maintaining military facilities. Santos, I need you to understand that this assessment is designed to help you improve your performance efficiency, Walsh explained as she positioned herself to observe Maria's morning routine. Colonel Hartwell wants to ensure that all personnel are optimizing their time allocation and focusing their efforts on mission-essential tasks only. Her tone carried the authority of someone delivering official policy, though her obvious discomfort suggested she harbored doubts about the wisdom of the directive. The irony of being lectured about mission-essential tasks by someone who had never Faced actual mission pressure wasn't lost on Maria, but she maintained the respectful demeanor that had served her well throughout 3 years of civilian employment. She understood that Walsh was simply implementing policies developed by leadership that had never performed the work they were attempting to optimize, and she recognized that defending her methods would only escalate an already problematic situation. Productivity assessment revealed exactly what Hartwell had expected to find. Maria's approach to cleaning medical facilities required 37% more time than the efficiency software calculated as optimal, while her attention to equipment safety exceeded standard protocols by what the system classified as 42%. The measurements were mathematically precise and operationally meaningless, reducing professional competence to statistical deviations that supported predetermined conclusions about inefficient resource allocation. Walsh documented each measurement with bureaucratic thoroughness, creating digital records that would become part of Maria's personnel file and justify whatever administrative actions Hartwell decided to implement. The assessment process transformed Maria's daily work into a series of performance failures, reframing professional excellence as evidence of inability to understand basic job requirements and follow simple efficiency guidelines. Tuesday's evaluation introduced additional complications when Hartwell assigned 2 junior enlisted personnel to observe Maria's work and identify learning opportunities that would help them avoid similar efficiency problems in their own positions. The soldiers, both recent graduates of basic training with no maintenance experience, were instructed to document instances where Maria exceeded time allocations or demonstrated what the colonel termed counterproductive perfectionism that inhibited optimal task completion. The assignment placed the young soldiers in an impossible position. They could see that Maria's work quality far exceeded anything they had observed from other maintenance personnel, but their instructions required them to identify problems with her performance that would justify corrective action. Private First Class David Chun and Specialist Amanda Rodriguez exchanged uncomfortable glances as they struggled to document deficiencies in work that obviously represented exceptional professional competence. "Ma'am," Chun ventured carefully, as he watched Maria meticulously clean around sensitive communication equipment, "your attention to detail is really impressive. I've never seen anyone maintain equipment areas to these standards." His comment reflected genuine appreciation for craftsmanship that reminded him of the precision demanded during his own military training, but it also violated the spirit of his assignment to identify efficiency problems. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Rodriguez nodded agreement while documenting the interaction for her required report. It's like watching someone who really understands the importance of proper equipment. Maintenance. The medical personnel always comment on how much better their equipment functions after Santos has cleaned their areas. Her observation highlighted the practical benefits of Maria's thoroughness, but also created documentation that would contradict Hartwell's efficiency narrative. The week progressed with escalating demands for documentation and measurement that transformed Maria's workplace into a testing laboratory for business management theories. Hartwell had implemented what she called continuous improvement monitoring that required hourly productivity assessments, supply usage calculations, and quality evaluations that reduced professional maintenance work to statistical data points that could be analyzed according to corporate efficiency models. Master Sergeant Crawford found himself caught between his professional obligation to implement command directives and his growing recognition that those directives were fundamentally inappropriate for military operations. His daily reports to Colonel Hartwell documented the required efficiency measurements while carefully avoiding language that might acknowledge the superior quality of Maria's work or question the wisdom of the optimization initiative. "Ma'am, the productivity assessments are generating extensive data about maintenance operations. Crawford reported during his weekly briefing with Hartwell. "We're documenting time allocations, supply usage patterns, and quality metrics according to your specifications." His careful neutrality masked growing frustration with policies that prioritized measurement over mission accomplishment. But he understood that direct criticism would only make the situation worse for everyone involved. Hartwell reviewed Crawford's reports with the satisfaction of someone whose analytical framework was generating exactly the kind of evidence she needed to justify personnel actions. "Excellent, Master Sergeant. The data clearly demonstrates that certain employees are failing to understand appropriate performance standards. We need to implement corrective measures that align individual behavior with organizational efficiency requirements." Her confidence in business management solutions convinced her that the maintenance department's problems could be resolved through better supervision and clearer performance expectations. The Colonel's next initiative involved what she called peer performance comparison analysis that required other maintenance personnel to evaluate Maria's work according to efficiency standards that prioritize speed over quality. The comparison process was designed to demonstrate that Maria's performance patterns represented deviation from normal productivity levels rather than exceptional professional competence, creating documentation that would support disciplinary action for failing to meet optimization requirements. The other janitors understood immediately that they were being asked to participate in building a case against one of their most competent colleagues. Several refused to provide the critical assessments that Hartwell was seeking, explaining that they couldn't identify problems with work that consistently exceeded their own standards. Their reluctance to cooperate frustrated the Colonel, who interpreted their responses as evidence of inadequate supervision rather than recognition of Maria's superior capabilities. Thursday brought the introduction of efficiency coaching sessions, where Walsh was assigned to provide Maria with guidance on appropriate time allocation and quality standard optimization. The coaching process required Maria to modify her cleaning procedures according to business efficiency principles that eliminated what Hartwell considered unnecessary attention to detail while focusing effort on tasks that provided maximum productivity return on investment. "Santos, you need to understand that spending additional time on equipment cleaning doesn't provide corresponding value for the time investment," Walsh explained during their first coaching session. "Colonel Hartwell wants you to focus on completing assigned tasks efficiently rather than exceeding requirements that don't contribute to mission accomplishment." The irony of receiving instruction about mission accomplishment from administrative personnel who had never faced actual mission pressure highlighted the fundamental disconnect between Hartwell's management philosophy and military operational realities. The coaching sessions required Maria to demonstrate improved cleaning techniques that eliminated steps she knew were essential for maintaining equipment safety and operational readiness. She was instructed to reduce her attention to detail, decrease her time investment in complex areas, and focus on achieving acceptable rather than exceptional results. The process felt like systematic destruction of professional standards that had been ingrained through years of military training where equipment failure could result in mission compromise and loss of life. Friday's evaluation included what Hartwell called a performance improvement conference, where Maria was formally counseled about her failure to adapt to efficiency optimization requirements. The meeting took place in Crawford's office with Walsh present as a witness, creating an official record of corrective action that would justify whatever personnel decisions the Colonel decided to implement. "Santos, your continued resistance to efficiency improvements suggests either inability to understand job requirements or unwillingness to comply with optimization directives," Crawford read from a script that Hartwell had prepared for the meeting. "We need to see immediate improvement in your time allocation and quality standard compliance, or we'll be forced to consider alternative approaches to ensuring appropriate performance levels." His discomfort with delivering the prepared remarks was obvious, but his position required him to implement policies regardless of his personal opinions about their wisdom. Maria listened to the criticism with the composed attention that military training had taught her to maintain under pressure, but she understood that the systematic campaign against her professional competence was approaching a conclusion that would force her to make difficult decisions about her future. The woman who had once been trusted with life and death responsibilities in combat zones was now being threatened with employment termination for maintaining standards that exceeded civilian expectations. The week concluded with documentation that painted Maria as a problem employee whose excessive attention to detail represented inefficient resource allocation and failure to understand basic job requirements. Hartwell's efficiency initiative had successfully reframed professional excellence as evidence of inadequate performance, creating the bureaucratic foundation for personnel action that would eliminate what the colonel viewed as a persistent deviation from optimal productivity standards. As Maria completed her Friday shift under continued observation and documentation, she recognized that her carefully maintained anonymity was about to be destroyed by a commanding officer whose management philosophy viewed competence as a threat to administrative efficiency rather than an asset to be protected and leveraged for organizational benefit. The fabricated crisis erupted on a Tuesday morning when Colonel Hartwell summoned Maria to her office with what she termed urgent documentation of serious performance violations that require immediate administrative action. The summons came through Master Sergeant Crawford, whose expression conveyed both professional duty and personal regret as he delivered the directive that would formally begin Maria's termination process. Maria entered Hartwell's office to find the colonel seated behind her imposing desk with several manila folders arranged in precise stacks, each containing what appeared to be extensive documentation. The morning light streaming through the windows highlighted the certificates and commendations covering the walls, creating an atmosphere of authority that was clearly designed to intimidate subordinates facing disciplinary action. Hartwell's expression carried the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a complex analytical project and was prepared to present her conclusions. "Miss Santos, please be seated," Hartwell began, her tone carrying the formal authority of someone delivering official judgment. "I've completed a comprehensive review of your performance patterns over the past several weeks, and I'm afraid the results are deeply concerning. The documentation reveals serious deficiencies in your understanding of job requirements and your ability to function effectively within established productivity parameters." Her language reflected the business terminology she favored, applied to personnel issues with the confidence of someone who believed that corporate management principles could solve any organizational challenge. The colonel opened the first folder and began reading from what she described as systematic evidence of performance failures that indicate fundamental incompatibility with position requirements. The documentation included timing reports that classified Maria's thoroughness as inefficiency, quality assessments that reframed her attention to detail as excessive perfectionism, and productivity analyses that interpreted her professional competence as failure to understand basic job expectations. Multiple supervisory observations have documented your consistent failure to complete assigned tasks within established time parameters, Hartwell continued, consulting her prepared remarks with the precision of someone delivering a formal presentation. Your excessive attention to unnecessary details has resulted in productivity levels that fall significantly below acceptable standards, while your resistance to efficiency coaching indicates either inability or unwillingness to modify counterproductive work patterns. Maria listened to her professional competence being systematically dismantled by carefully crafted language that transformed every aspect of her military-trained excellence into evidence of civilian employment failure. The documentation was comprehensive and completely divorced from the operational realities of maintaining military facilities, reflecting instead the kind of analytical framework that prioritized measurement over mission accomplishment and efficiency over effectiveness. The second folder contained what Hartwell described as witness statements and peer Evaluations that confirm systemic performance issues requiring corrective action. The statements had been gathered from personnel who had been instructed to identify problems with Maria's work, though several had actually provided positive assessments that the Colonel had reinterpreted to support her predetermined conclusions about inefficient resource allocation and inappropriate time investment. Sergeant Walsh's productivity assessments clearly demonstrate your failure to optimize time allocation according to established efficiency protocols, Hartwell announced, reading from documents that reduced Maria's professional thoroughness to statistical deviations from corporate productivity models. Your continued investment of excessive time in routine maintenance tasks indicates fundamental misunderstanding of position requirements and organizational priorities. The accusations continued with mathematical precision, each point supported by documentation that had been carefully crafted to justify predetermined conclusions about performance inadequacy. Hartwell had constructed her case with the thoroughness of someone who understood bureaucratic requirements while remaining completely oblivious to the operational implications of her efficiency initiatives. The result was a compelling argument for termination that was based on fabricated evidence and fundamental misunderstanding of military maintenance requirements. The most concerning aspect of your performance pattern, Hartwell continued, is your apparent inability to respond appropriately to supervisory guidance and efficiency coaching. Multiple attempts to help you understand proper time allocation and quality standards have failed to produce the behavioral modifications necessary for acceptable job performance. Her tone carried the authority of someone who viewed employee counseling as a technical problem that could be solved through better application of management principles. Maria maintained her composure throughout the recitation of charges, drawing on military training that had taught her to process information under pressure while maintaining operational awareness of changing tactical situations. She understood that Hartwell's accusations were built on fabricated evidence and misrepresented facts, but she also recognized that the Colonel possessed the administrative authority to make those accusations into official reality regardless of their relationship to truth. The third folder contained what Hartwell described as safety and security concerns arising from inappropriate performance patterns that exceed position requirements and suggest possible security risks. The language was carefully chosen to imply that Maria's competence represented a threat rather than an asset, reframing her familiarity with military protocols as evidence of suspicious behavior that required investigation. Your excessive attention to equipment maintenance and facility security protocols raises questions about your understanding of appropriate civilian employee responsibilities, Hartwell announced, reading from accusations that transformed Maria's military training into evidence of potential security violations. Civilian maintenance personnel should focus on basic cleaning tasks, rather than demonstrating familiarity with operational procedures that exceed their authorization levels. The security accusations represented a particularly insidious escalation of Hartwell's campaign, suggesting that Maria's professional competence indicated possible espionage or inappropriate access to classified information. The charges were completely fabricated, but structured according to security protocols that would require investigation and could result in criminal referral regardless of their ultimate validity. Hartwell had crafted accusations that would destroy Maria's reputation and employment prospects while protecting herself from criticism through appeals to national security concerns. Additionally, the Colonel continued, your resistance to supervision and failure to modify performance patterns, despite repeated coaching sessions, suggests either psychological issues that impair your judgment or deliberate insubordination that represents security risk to base operations. The psychological fitness accusations added another layer of bureaucratic complexity that would require professional evaluation and create additional barriers to defending against the charges. Maria recognized that Hartwell had constructed a comprehensive case for termination that addressed every possible avenue of appeal or defense. The accusations spanned performance inadequacy, security concerns, and psychological fitness, creating a web of charges that would require extensive documentation and professional evaluation to refute. The colonel had learned from her business management training that the key to successful personnel actions was building cases so comprehensive that resistance became practically impossible. The meeting continued with Hartwell's presentation of what she called corrective action options that address documented performance deficiencies while protecting organizational security interests. The options included immediate termination for cause, voluntary resignation to avoid negative employment references, or acceptance of disciplinary action that would include probationary status and continued intensive supervision pending demonstration of performance improvement. Ms. Santos, I want to be clear that these concerns have been documented through proper channels and reported to appropriate security personnel for evaluation, Hartwell announced with the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. Your continued employment depends on immediate demonstration of your ability to function within established parameters and comply with organizational requirements without the supervision intensity that has proven necessary over recent weeks. The security referral represented the most serious escalation of the fabricated crisis, involving base security personnel in what Hartwell had characterized as investigation of potential security risks arising from civilian employee behavior that exceeded appropriate boundaries. The referral would create official documentation that would follow Maria throughout any future employment applications and could result in loss of security clearance that would eliminate most opportunities for military-related civilian employment. Maria understood that she was facing a coordinated attack that had been carefully planned and systematically implemented by a commanding officer who possessed both the authority and the bureaucratic sophistication to destroy her civilian career through fabricated charges and misrepresented evidence. The woman who had once faced enemy fire with calm professionalism was now confronting a different kind of warfare that used administrative procedures and security protocols as weapons against someone whose only crime had been maintaining military standards in a civilian position. The meeting concluded with Hartwell's directive that Maria had 48 hours to decide whether she would accept voluntary resignation, submit to intensive rehabilitation supervision, or face formal termination. Proceedings that would include security investigation and potential criminal referral. The timeline was designed to prevent Maria from obtaining legal counsel or mounting an effective defense, while the range of accusations ensured that any response would require extensive documentation that she didn't possess and couldn't obtain. Within the specified timeframe. As Maria left Hartwell's office, she carried with her the full weight of a systematic campaign that had successfully transformed professional excellence into evidence of security risk and employment failure. The colonel's satisfaction was evident as she watched Maria walk away, confident that her efficiency initiative had successfully identified and addressed a persistent problem that had threatened optimal resource allocation and organizational productivity. The fabricated crisis was complete, built on months of careful documentation and supported by bureaucratic procedures that would make resistance difficult and expensive. Hartwell had achieved what she viewed as a management success, eliminating an employee whose performance patterns had represented deviation from efficient operations while creating documentation that would protect her from criticism or administrative review. But the colonel had no way of knowing that her systematic attack on a janitor was about to attract attention from levels of military command that possessed very different perspectives on the value of excellence and the importance of protecting those who served with distinction and honor. The unprecedented response began 24 hours after Maria's meeting with Colonel Hartwell, when Master Sergeant Crawford made a decision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of events at Fort Harrison. Unable to reconcile his professional obligations with his conscience, Crawford placed a secure phone call to his former first sergeant, Command Sergeant Major Patricia Williams, who now served at Fort Bragg as senior enlisted advisor to Major General Robert Sterling, one of the Army's most respected division commanders. Crawford's voice carried the weight of 32 years of military experience as he described the systematic persecution of a civilian employee whose work ethic and attention to detail suggested a military background that deserved investigation rather than punishment. "Sergeant Major, something's not right here. This woman works like someone who understands what's at stake when equipment fails or facilities aren't properly maintained. She's being destroyed for maintaining standards that most of our own soldiers couldn't match." Williams listened with the attention of someone who had spent decades recognizing the difference between administrative efficiency and operational excellence. Her own experience had taught her that exceptional performance in routine duties often indicated background and capabilities that warranted protection rather than persecution. The systematic nature of the campaign, Crawford described, triggered instincts that had been honed through years of protecting soldiers from incompetent leadership and bureaucratic persecution. "Jim, I need you to fax me everything you have on this situation," Williams instructed, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had navigated complex personnel issues throughout her career. "Performance patterns like you're describing don't happen by accident. If this woman has a military background that explains her competence, she deserves protection rather than persecution, and a command structure that's targeting her needs to understand the implications of their actions." Within hours, Williams had forwarded Crawford's documentation to General Sterling's office with a cover memorandum that outlined her concerns about potential persecution of a military veteran by leadership that had failed to recognize the value of the capabilities they were attempting to eliminate. Sterling, a combat veteran with 3 deployments who had built his reputation on protecting soldiers and honoring military service, immediately understood the implications of what Williams was reporting. General Sterling's response was swift and decisive. He placed a secure call to the Inspector General's office at Fort Harrison, initiating what he described as a preliminary inquiry into personnel management practices that may indicate systematic failure to recognize and protect military service members transitioning to civilian employment. The inquiry would be conducted by Colonel Marcus Thompson, a veteran investigator whose reputation for thoroughness and integrity made him the obvious choice for evaluating complex personnel situations. But Sterling's intervention extended beyond official channels. His decades of military service had taught him that some situations required the kind of informal coordination that could address problems before they became institutional scandals. He began making calls to colleagues throughout the command structure, alerting them to a developing situation that might require broader attention and coordinated response from leadership that understood the importance of protecting military veterans from administrative persecution. The response that followed was unprecedented in its scope and coordination. At Fort Stewart, Brigadier General Lisa Rodriguez received Sterling's call while reviewing personnel reports from installations throughout her area of responsibility. Rodriguez, who had commanded units in both Iraq and Afghanistan, immediately understood the implications of a situation where military competence was being punished rather than recognized and protected. "Bob, if this woman has the kind of background your investigation suggests, she represents exactly the type of veteran we need to be protecting and supporting, rather than allowing incompetent civilian leadership to destroy," Rodriguez told Sterling during their secure conversation. "I'm going to make some calls and ensure that the right people understand what's happening at Fort Harrison before this becomes the kind of scandal that reflects poorly on our entire institution." Rodriguez's calls initiated a cascade of responses from military leadership throughout the southeastern United States. At Fort Campbell, Major General James Mitchell interrupted his morning briefings to review the situation that Rodriguez had described, immediately recognizing patterns that suggested Systematic failure of leadership at the installation level. Mitchell had commanded the 101st Airborne Division during some of the most challenging operations in Afghanistan, and his experience had taught him to identify and protect the kind of exceptional personnel who made the difference between mission success and failure. The response at Fort Benning was equally swift. Colonel Sarah Chun, who served as deputy commander for operations, reviewed the preliminary information that Mitchell had forwarded and immediately understood that the situation at Fort Harrison represented more than isolated personnel mismanagement. Chun had spent her career identifying and developing exceptional military talent, and the description of systematic persecution of competence triggered every instinct she had developed for protecting valuable personnel from incompetent leadership. This is exactly the kind of situation that destroys confidence in our ability to protect people who serve with distinction. Chun told her chief of staff during an emergency briefing on the developing situation. If we allow civilian leadership to persecute military veterans for maintaining the standards we taught them, we're sending a message that excellence is liability rather than asset, and that's completely unacceptable from both institutional and moral perspectives. The coordination continued through secure communication networks that connected military leadership throughout the region. At Fort Gordon, Brigadier General David Park received briefings that described a pattern of persecution that violated every principle of leadership development and personnel protection that the Army had spent decades refining. Park's own background as a former enlisted soldier who had risen through the ranks gave him particular sensitivity to situations where institutional power was being used to crush individual excellence. The informal network of communication had alerted more than 20 general officers to the developing situation at Fort Harrison within 36 hours of Crawford's initial phone call. Each had reviewed the preliminary information through their own lens of experience and reached similar conclusions about the need for coordinated response to what appeared to be systematic failure of leadership at the installation level. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Colonel Thompson's preliminary investigation had revealed that Maria Santos possessed security clearances that required review of her complete military record, including service documentation, that had been classified at levels that indicated specialized training and combat experience. The revelation that Fort Harrison's janitorial staff included someone with top-secret clearances immediately elevated the situation to levels of command that possessed very different perspectives on the value of exceptional personnel. Thompson's secure call to the Pentagon reached the office of Lieutenant General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, who immediately understood that the situation at Fort Harrison represented potential institutional failure that required immediate attention from the highest levels of Army leadership. Morrison had spent her career managing personnel issues that affected Army-wide policies and the systematic persecution of military competence that Thompson described triggered concerns about broader patterns that might require comprehensive review and correction. Colonel Thompson, I want you to understand that this investigation now has the attention of Army leadership at levels that will ensure appropriate resolution regardless of local command preferences, Morrison informed Inspector General during their secure conversation. If this woman has the kind of service record that preliminary indicators suggest, her persecution represents exactly the type of institutional failure that undermines confidence in our ability to protect people who serve with distinction and honor. The Pentagon's involvement guaranteed that the situation at Fort Harrison would receive scrutiny from military leadership that possessed both the authority and the institutional perspective necessary to address systematic failures of command judgment. Morrison's office began coordinating with other senior staff elements to ensure that the investigation would have access to all necessary resources and that the results would be communicated to levels of leadership that could implement appropriate corrective measures. As word of the investigation spread through military command channels, The response became increasingly coordinated and comprehensive. Installation commanders throughout the region received informal briefings about developing situations that might require their attention and support. Personnel officers were alerted to potential patterns of veteran persecution that might exist at their own installations. Senior enlisted leaders began reviewing their own procedures for protecting, transitioning military personnel from civilian leadership that might not understand or appreciate military capabilities. The unprecedented nature of the response reflected both the gravity of the situation and the military's institutional commitment to protecting personnel who had served with distinction. Multiple levels of command were now focused on a situation that had begun as local personnel management, but had evolved into a potential case study of leadership failure that could affect Army-wide policies and procedures. At Fort Harrison, Colonel Hartwell remained completely unaware that her efficiency initiative had attracted attention from levels of military leadership that possessed very different perspectives on the value of excellence and the importance of protecting those who maintained military standards regardless of their current position. Her satisfaction with resolving what she viewed as a persistent personnel problem was about to be shattered by revelations that would fundamentally alter her understanding of both Maria Santos and the implications of her own management decisions. Storm that was building around Fort Harrison represented more than investigation of local personnel issues. It had become a test of the military's institutional commitment to protecting excellence and honoring service, regardless of whether that service was being performed in uniform or civilian clothes. The truth began to emerge on Thursday morning, when Major General Robert Sterling arrived at Fort Harrison unannounced, accompanied by Colonel Thompson and a team of investigators whose presence immediately signaled that routine personnel management had escalated into high-level command attention. Sterling's decision to conduct the investigation personally reflected both the gravity of the situation and his determination to ensure that institutional failures were addressed at the appropriate command level. Colonel Hartwell received notification of the general's arrival through her aide-de-camp, who delivered the message with obvious nervousness about the implications of surprise visits from division-level leadership. "Ma'am, Major General Sterling is requesting immediate access to all personnel files related to Maintenance Department operations, specifically documentation concerning civilian employee Maria Santos," the aide reported, his tone conveying uncertainty about what such requests might indicate about the command climate at Fort Harrison. Hartwell's initial reaction combined surprise with confidence that her efficiency initiatives would withstand scrutiny from higher command. She had documented her decisions thoroughly, following business management principles that she believed demonstrated professional competence and fiscal responsibility. "Prepare the conference room for a briefing on Maintenance Department optimization," she instructed her staff, maintaining the authoritative demeanor that had characterized her approach to command throughout her tenure at Fort Harrison. But Sterling's investigation followed patterns that Hartwell had never encountered during her administrative career. Rather than reviewing efficiency reports and productivity metrics, the general began with Maria's security clearance documentation, personnel records that revealed service history extending far beyond anything that civilian janitorial positions typically required. The classified nature of Maria's military background meant that access required security protocols that immediately indicated exceptional rather than routine service. "Colonel Hartwell," Sterling began when they met in the installation's secure conference facility, "I need you to explain why someone with Maria Santos's security clearance levels and military background is working as a janitor while being subjected to disciplinary action for performance that appears to exceed rather than fall short of professional standards." His tone carried the weight of command authority, backed by decades of combat experience and personnel management at levels that demanded accountability for leadership decisions. The revelation that Maria possessed security clearances struck Hartwell like a physical blow. Her efficiency analysis had been based on assumptions about civilian employee backgrounds that were apparently completely incorrect, and her confidence in business management principles suddenly seemed inadequate for addressing personnel issues that involved classified military service. "Sir, I was not aware of any specialized background. My evaluation was based on civilian employee performance standards that seemed appropriate for basic maintenance positions." Sterling's expression reflected the controlled patience of someone who had spent years addressing leadership failures that resulted from incomplete information and inadequate analysis. "Colonel, before implementing personnel actions against individuals with military backgrounds, particularly those with security clearances that indicate specialized service, military leadership has an obligation to understand what we're dealing with rather than making assumptions based on current job classifications." The general's investigation team had spent the previous day reviewing Maria's complete military record, including classified service documentation that painted a picture of exceptional performance under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. The records revealed multiple combat deployments, specialized medical training, leadership positions that required security clearances at levels that most officers never achieved, and decorations that recognized both courage under fire and technical competence that had saved lives in hostile environments. Colonel Thompson presented the findings with the methodical precision of someone who understood that institutional credibility depended on accurate representation of facts. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Santos served 3 combat tours as a special operations medic, received multiple decorations for valor, and was medically retired following injuries sustained while performing life-saving medical procedures under enemy fire. Her security clearance levels reflect access to compartmentalized information related to special operations medical protocols." The documentation revealed a service record that commanded respect from any military professional who understood the demands of special operations and the level of competence required for medical personnel supporting elite units in combat environments. Maria's decorations included not only recognition for courage under fire, but technical awards that acknowledged medical expertise applied under conditions that would challenge the most experienced military personnel. Additionally, Thompson continued, consulting classified documentation that revealed the full scope of Maria's military achievements. Her medical discharge resulted from traumatic brain injury, sustained during emergency medical procedures that saved the lives of 3 special operations personnel during enemy contact. The Army's medical retirement recognized both her service and the sacrifice that ended her military career while acknowledging capabilities that extended far beyond standard military medical training. Sterling reviewed the service record with the appreciation of someone who had commanded special operations units and understood exactly what Maria's background represented in terms of training, experience, and demonstrated performance under pressure. The revelation that such exceptional personnel had been working as a janitor while facing persecution for maintaining military standards created implications that extended far beyond local personnel management issues. "Colonel Hartwell," Sterling said, turning his attention back to the installation commander, "I need you to understand that your efficiency initiative targeted someone whose military service represents exactly the kind of excellence that our institution is supposed to recognize and protect. The systematic persecution documented by your own reports demonstrates fundamental failure to understand both military values and institutional obligations to personnel who have served with distinction." The general's criticism carried implications that extended beyond immediate personnel issues. Hartwell's leadership decisions had created potential institutional scandal that could affect Army-wide confidence in protection of military veterans transitioning to civilian employment. The systematic nature of her campaign against competence suggested patterns of leadership failure that required correction at levels extending beyond local command. Thompson's investigation had also revealed that Maria's work performance at Fort Harrison consistently exceeded standards that most military personnel struggled to achieve, demonstrating continued application of training and experience that represented millions of dollars in specialized education and combat-tested competence. The irony that such capabilities were being criticized rather than leveraged highlighted fundamental failures in personnel management that had broader implications for institutional effectiveness. Sir, Hartwell attempted, recognizing that her position was rapidly becoming untenable. If I had been aware of Santos's background, my approach would obviously have been different. The efficiency review was based on civilian employment standards that seemed appropriate given the information available through normal personnel channels. Her attempt at explanation reflected genuine shock at revelations that fundamentally altered her understanding of the situation she had created. Sterling's response demonstrated the kind of leadership accountability that distinguished effective command from administrative management. Colonel, military leadership requires understanding the people we're responsible for before making decisions that affect their careers and welfare. Your failure to investigate background before implementing disciplinary action represents exactly the kind of leadership failure that undermines institutional credibility and damages people who deserve protection rather than persecution. The investigation continued with interviews of personnel who had observed Maria's work and the systematic campaign that had been mounted against her professional competence. Master Sergeant Crawford's testimony provided detailed documentation of efficiency initiatives that had targeted excellence rather than addressing actual performance problems, while other maintenance personnel described witnessing persecution of someone whose capabilities obviously exceeded civilian employment requirements. Sergeant Walsh's reluctant testimony revealed the systematic nature of documentation that had been designed to support predetermined conclusions rather than accurately assess performance. Her admission that she had been instructed to identify problems with work that obviously exceeded standard requirements provided evidence of coordinated campaigns that violated both military values and basic principles of fair personnel management. Investigation's most damaging revelation concerned Hartwell's fabricated security concerns that had elevated routine personnel issues to levels requiring criminal investigation. Thompson's review of the accusations revealed systematic misrepresentation of facts, designed to justify disciplinary action through appeals to national security that were completely unsupported by actual evidence or legitimate operational concerns. Colonel Hartwell, Sterling concluded after reviewing the complete investigation findings, your efficiency initiative created systematic persecution of military competence that violated every principle of leadership this institution represents. The fabricated security accusations demonstrate willful disregard for facts in service of predetermined conclusions that could have destroyed the career and reputation of someone who served this country with distinction and honor. The General's final judgment carried the weight of institutional authority and personal experience that left no room for argument or justification. Effective immediately, you are relieved of command pending investigation of leadership failure that extends beyond this single incident. Your systematic persecution of excellence suggests patterns that require comprehensive review of your entire command tenure and its impact on personnel under your authority. As Hartwell was escorted from the conference room by military police, Sterling turned his attention to addressing the damage that had been done to someone whose service record commanded respect from anyone who understood the true meaning of military excellence and the sacrifices made by those who served in the most dangerous environments imaginable. The truth had been revealed, but the work of restoring justice and protecting those who deserved institutional support was just beginning. Major General Sterling found Maria in the break room of the maintenance building, sitting alone with a cup of coffee and the resignation letter she had been preparing since her meeting with Colonel Hartwell, the woman who had once commanded respect. in the most elite military units, now looked up with the cautious expression of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from authority figures, her posture reflecting 3 years of deliberate invisibility that had become second nature. "Miss Santos," Sterling said quietly, settling into the chair across from her with the informal manner of someone who understood that rank could be a barrier to honest communication. "I'm Major General Robert Sterling, and I need to apologize on behalf of an institution that failed to recognize and protect someone who served with the kind of distinction that commands respect from every level of military leadership." His words carried the weight of genuine regret and institutional accountability that Maria had never expected to hear. Maria's initial response reflected the careful neutrality she had maintained throughout 3 years of civilian employment. But Sterling's mention of her service triggered recognition that her carefully guarded background had been discovered by someone who understood its significance. "Sir, I've tried to do my job to the best of my ability while staying out of situations that might cause problems for anyone," she replied, her tone maintaining the respectful professionalism that had characterized her interactions with military personnel throughout her civilian employment. Sterling placed a folder on the table between them, its red classification markings indicating access to information that few people were authorized to review. "Maria, I've spent the last 2 days reviewing your complete service record, including classified documentation of operations that most people will never know happened and heroism that deserves recognition from anyone who understands what you accomplished during your military career." His voice carried the appreciation of someone who had commanded similar operations and understood exactly what her service record represented. The folder contained documentation that told the story of exceptional military service, combat medical operations in the most dangerous environments, life-saving procedures performed under enemy fire, leadership responsibilities that required security clearances at levels indicating trust and capabilities that extended far beyond standard military training. Sterling reviewed each decoration and commendation with the expertise of someone who understood both the requirements for such recognition and the personal sacrifice that earning them required. "Your Silver Star citation describes emergency medical procedures performed during a 43-minute firefight that saved the lives of 3 special operations personnel," Sterling continued, reading from classified records that documented actions that had never received public recognition. "The medical officer who recommended you for that decoration described your performance as exceptional, even by special operations standards, demonstrating competence and courage that represented the finest traditions of military service under the most challenging circumstances imaginable." Maria listened to her military accomplishments being recounted by someone who obviously understood their significance. But years of civilian employment had taught her to manage expectations about recognition or appreciation that rarely materialized. "Sir, that was a long time ago, and circumstances were different then. I've been focused on fulfilling my current responsibilities without creating complications that might affect other people," she said, maintaining the careful language that had helped her navigate civilian workplace dynamics. Sterling's response demonstrated the kind of leadership accountability that distinguished effective command from bureaucratic management. "Maria, the circumstances that led to your medical retirement don't diminish the value of your service or the capabilities you demonstrated throughout 15 years of exceptional military performance. The institution failed you by allowing civilian leadership to persecute excellence instead of recognizing and protecting someone whose background commands respect from anyone who understands what military service actually requires." The general's investigation had revealed not only the systematic nature of Hartwell's persecution, but also the broader implications of policies that had targeted competence rather than addressing legitimate performance issues. The documentation showed a pattern of leadership failure that extended beyond individual prejudice to institutional breakdown that could affect Army-wide confidence and protection of military veterans transitioning to civilian employment. The efficiency initiative that targeted your performance demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of both military values and institutional obligations to personnel who have served with distinction, Sterling explained, consulting notes from Thompson's comprehensive investigation. Colonel Hartwell's systematic campaign against your professional competence violated every principle of leadership this institution represents, while her fabricated security accusations represented willful disregard for facts in service of predetermined conclusions designed to justify persecution rather than address legitimate concerns. Sterling's next revelation fundamentally altered Maria's understanding of her situation and future prospects. Maria, the Army is implementing comprehensive reforms to prevent similar persecution of military veterans in civilian positions. Your case has become the foundation for new policies that will require background investigation before disciplinary action against personnel with military service, mandatory training for civilian supervisors working with veteran employees, and institutional protection for those who maintain military standards regardless of their current employment classification. The institutional changes represented acknowledgement that Maria's persecution reflected broader patterns that required systematic correction rather than isolated personnel action. The Army had recognized that protecting military values required institutional commitment that extended beyond active duty service to encompass veterans whose capabilities deserved recognition and protection rather than persecution by leadership that failed to understand what military service actually represented. Additionally, Sterling continued, the Secretary of the Army has personally reviewed your case and authorized me to offer you immediate recall to active duty with promotion to Master Sergeant and assignment to a position that utilizes your medical training and special operations background. The offer includes full recognition of your service, restoration of all benefits that should have been available throughout your transition period, and assignment to medical training facilities, where your experience would be invaluable for developing the next generation of military medical personnel. The offer represented complete vindication and restoration of the military career that traumatic brain injury had interrupted, but it also required Maria to make decisions about a future she had never imagined possible. The woman who had spent 3 years cleaning floors in facilities where she had once held positions of enormous responsibility was now being offered the opportunity to return to meaningful service that would utilize capabilities that civilian employment had never acknowledged. Maria's response reflected both gratitude and careful consideration of implications that extended beyond personal satisfaction. Sir, I'm honored by the offer and grateful for the investigation that revealed the truth about what happened here. But I need to understand whether accepting active duty recall would address the broader issues that affected other people who were caught up in Colonel Hartwell's efficiency initiatives. Her concern for others demonstrated the same selfless commitment that had characterized her military service and earned recognition for leadership under pressure. Sterling's answer revealed the comprehensive nature of institutional response that Maria's case had generated. The investigation has resulted in complete review of personnel management practices at Fort Harrison and implementation of Army-wide training programs designed to prevent similar persecution of veteran employees. Master Sergeant Crawford has been promoted and transferred to a position where his experience protecting personnel will be utilized for developing better supervisory practices, while other maintenance personnel affected by the efficiency initiatives have received recognition and compensation for enduring systematic workplace persecution. The institutional changes extended beyond Fort Harrison to encompass Army-wide recognition that protecting military values required a comprehensive approach that included veteran employees whose capabilities deserved institutional support rather than civilian persecution. Maria's case had become the catalyst for reforms that would protect other veterans from similar systematic targeting by leadership that failed to Understand or appreciate military service and its continuing value regardless of current employment status. The most significant change, Sterling continued, involves mandatory military advisor positions at installations with significant veteran civilian employment. These advisors will ensure that personnel decisions involving veterans include appropriate consideration of military background and institutional obligations to protect those who have served with distinction. Your case demonstrated that civilian leadership without military experience requires institutional support for making appropriate decisions about personnel whose capabilities extend beyond their current job classifications. As their conversation continued, Maria began to understand that her quiet perseverance through systematic persecution had generated institutional changes that would protect other veterans from similar treatment while creating opportunities for meaningful service that utilized military capabilities regardless of employment status. The woman who had cleaned floors while maintaining military standards had become the foundation for Army-wide recognition that excellence deserved protection rather than persecution. Sterling's final offer represented both personal vindication and institutional transformation. Maria, your choice about active duty recall will be respected regardless of your decision, but I want you to understand that your service continues to make a difference for this institution and the people it serves. Whether in uniform or civilian clothes, your commitment to excellence represents exactly what military service should produce, and the Army is committed to ensuring that such dedication receives the recognition and protection it deserves. The meeting concluded with Maria accepting the offer for active duty recall, but more importantly, with institutional acknowledgement that military values required protection that extended beyond active service to encompass all those who maintained the standards of excellence that defined the best traditions of military service. Her journey from persecution to vindication had become the foundation for changes that would protect countless other veterans while demonstrating that institutional integrity ultimately prevailed over administrative persecution when leadership possessed the courage to investigate, acknowledge, and correct systematic failures. The transformation was complete, but its impact would continue through policies and protections that ensured Maria's experience would prevent similar persecution while creating opportunities for veterans whose capabilities deserved recognition rather than systematic destruction. By leadership that failed to understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice, 6 months later, Master Sergeant Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the Army Medical Training Center, delivering a lecture on combat trauma procedures to the next generation of military medics. The same hands that had once pushed a mop now demonstrated life-saving techniques to soldiers who would carry those skills into harm's way. In the front row sat General Sterling, Master Sergeant Crawford, and dozens of officers who had learned that true leadership meant protecting excellence rather than punishing it. Colonel Hartwell's efficiency manuals had been replaced by the Santos protocols, comprehensive guidelines ensuring that veteran employees received the recognition and protection their service had earned. The maintenance building at Fort Harrison now displays a bronze plaque in honor of all veterans who serve with quiet dignity, maintaining the standards that define military excellence regardless of uniform or position. Maria had requested that inscription, understanding that her story represented thousands of veterans whose contributions went unrecognized until someone with authority chose to look beyond surface appearances. During her speech, Maria held up the silver star that had remained hidden in a box for 3 years. "Excellence isn't defined by the job you do," she told the assembled medics. "It's defined by how you do whatever job you're given. Some of you may face moments when maintaining your standards feels impossible, when authority questions your commitment, when your best efforts seem unappreciated. Remember that integrity isn't about recognition. It's about who you are when no one is watching." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. What moment of quiet strength have you witnessed that changed everything? Share your story in the comments. Below, we read every single one. If this story inspired you to look beyond surface appearances and recognize hidden excellence, hit that subscribe button. We bring you real stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things every week. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Our community spans the globe, united by stories that remind us what true leadership looks like.